Welcome to the Cable Climb. I'm Brady Volpe, and in this series we explore how cable and broadband professionals work their way up the ranks, sharing valuable lessons and insights so that you can apply them to your own career. Today, I'm excited to bring on a guest you might remember from our Back to Basics show, a true industry veteran with a wealth of experience in cable technology, Ron Hranac. Ron started where many of us did, out in the field, troubleshooting and learning the ropes, but over time, he's built an impressive career by constantly sharpening his skills, taking on new challenges, and helping others do the same. In this episode, Ron will share the key steps and mindset shifts that helped him rise through the broadband industry. If you're a technician looking for practical, real-world advice on how to move forward in your own path, then this conversation is for you. So let's dive into the details and learn from one of the best. Join me in welcoming Ron Hranac to the Cable Climb. Ron, welcome.
Well, thanks, Brady, and thank you for the nice introduction. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm happy to be able to share hopefully some useful tidbits of information that might be of benefit to others.
It's an absolute pleasure, Ron. You've definitely been one of my heroes and one of my mentors in the cable industry, so I'm very excited to get your perspective in this and understand, what your career has been like growing in the cable industry. And I'd like to start off by understanding, what was your first job in the cable broadband industry?
Oh, my first job was somewhat surprisingly, I won't call it a completely indoor job, but because there were outdoor parts of it. But I was hired as a part-time camera operator while I was still in school in the cable company's local origination studio. It was the cable system in my hometown in northern Idaho, and I heard about a job opening to be a camera operator. So I thought, well, this sounds like something fun, because at the time and even today, I had an interest in many things technical, and it sounded like something fun to do. So that was my first job, and I worked my way up through the ranks in local origination operation, became a video technician, repairing and maintaining the cameras and equipment in studio and switching equipment, and then eventually the program director of the entire local origination operation in that cable system. And from there, I moved to a one-year stint building a local origination TV studio in the basement of a radio station in Moscow, Idaho, about 30 miles north of my hometown. They were looking at a leaseback project where they would lease back program content from this local origination studio to the local cable company there. And then when that project wrapped up, I went back to my hometown, and that's when I went to work in the outside plant and learned to climb poles, and started as an installer, then an installer technician, service technician, and like to tell people that I worked my way up the pole. So
literally. Was there something about the cable industry that kept you coming back, that made you say, I like this industry? Or what was that defining moment for you? Or was it just you kept going at it?
Well, I think it was probably the latter, a bit more of continuing to be involved with it, because when I started in 1972, and again, this was in local origination, I was fortunate to have worked with some colleagues in that cable system who had been there for a long time. Some had been there since that system was built in 1953, and others, in later years, the 60s and so on. They put up with my questions, and of course, you know me pretty well. So they were never-ending questions, occasional arguments, but they were always willing to share what they knew. And that left a big impression on me. It was, hey, wait a minute, here's a chance to ask questions, to learn, and the learning never stopped. I took instruction manuals home and brochures and other things, and I did that for the first several years in both the local origination side and in the outside plant side, and continued to learn. And what I found was the example that my coworkers shared with me, that is, they were sharing what they knew. I thought, that's something I could do. and I continued to learn throughout my career. In fact, even in retirement now, I still continue the learning journey. But the other part of that, in addition to continuing the learning piece, is to share what I've learned. And that started, early on with it was a teleprompter newsletter that I think was just for the region, Washington State, Idaho, maybe Montana, and a couple others. So I started writing a couple little technical contributions for that newsletter. The writing was so back then. And then in, what was it, late 72, early 73. So not long after I joined and was still contributing stuff to the company's internal newsletter, I wrote a paper for the U.S. Army Science and Humanities Symposium in Salt Lake City. Well, it wasn't Salt Lake City. It was near Salt Lake City. It was at the University of Utah. So that was about the prospects of the cable industry and two-way cable and remote meter reading and all these other things that were in the promise folder of a two-way cable network. Of course, in those days, two-way cable networks weren't real common. There were a few of them that had been around since the 60s, but they weren't real common. Unfortunately, that paper is long lost to history. I don't have a copy of it. But a more formal paper, I think, that became probably my first major paper was one that I wrote in 1984 for NCTA. And that was a look at the effects of single-ended push-pull and feed-forward amplifiers on video signals and also digital signals. And I did a whole bunch of measurements because at the time, Jones Intercable, who I worked for at that time, was rolling out Century 3 feed-forward amplifiers in some of its markets. And those early feed-forward amplifiers used delay lines and stuff, and I think they called them error amplifiers. I'd have to go back and do some digging to get the exact terminology. But I wondered if those delay lines and the cancellation and stuff that was going on to minimize or reduce distortions would have any impact on digital data being transported through cable networks. And my boss at the time said, we'll do some tests and find out. So I did a bunch of tests and found out that it had no effect, at least on the tests that I did. And I published that paper, and that was the very first one. And then the next year, 85, was when I was approached by Wayne Lasley, who was, I think, the managing editor of Communications Technology magazine. He saw a technical seminar that I had done for the then, I think it was still a meeting group, the Rocky Mountain Meeting Group. And he asked if I could turn that into a magazine article. And I said, well, I've never written a magazine article before. And he said, that's what editors are for. And the rest, as they say, is history.
Yeah, and Ron, I think your writings and your presentations are some of the, probably key decisions that have helped move you forward in your career, at least from my perspective, because I started reading your papers, some of your writings when I started my career in the early 90s. And I'm curious, what motivated you to start writing, to start doing presentations? And also, I mean, when you started doing it, were they as good as they are today, your papers and your presentations, or were they difficult for you to
do? One of my favorite answers to questions is it depends.
Yeah.
They're okay. I think the quality improved over the years because as I went through my career, I learned a lot, and occasionally would make a mistake in some of the writings, and somebody'd call me out and say, oops, and then I'd print a correction at some point in the magazine to hopefully try to make sure that the information was technically correct. I think the first technical seminars that I spoke in were local SCTE chapter and meeting group seminars. And that's the one I just mentioned about Wayne Lasley, the managing editor of CT Magazine, coming up and asking me to turn it into an article. And that first one appeared in the May 85 issue. It turned out to be a 3-part article on bench sweep, testing amplifiers and splitters and things on the test bench, because I was doing that at the time, and so I had a good understanding of it. Now, you ask about the writing and the way I write. The way I learn is very much visually.
Yes.
The hands-on part, of course, is very important. But in my own mind, to really get a good grasp on something, even very complex technologies, I need to be able to picture the concept in my mind. For some people, it's enough just to read and understand, and others might look at math and go through the equations and say, okay, that makes sense, I understand. And yes, those are all a piece of the foundation of learning. But for me, it's visualizing really difficult concepts and then figuring out a way to turn that visualization into something that's easy to understand. I mean, not only for me, but for other people. And then I would apply that to technical presentations that have made over the years, and even make to a lesser extent these days, and certainly in the magazine articles and papers that I've written over the decades. So it's trying to convey the visual concept in my mind into words that are hopefully relatively easy to understand. And I also try to target my writing style to a wider audience. So rather than writing like a PhD candidate, where it's okay, you got about 4 people who can understand this. It's really broad, so that it's good for the engineers, it's good for the technicians and installers, but good for a broader audience. And that, yes, there will be some people that might say, okay, that from the high level perspective, that's a little too simplistic, but that's intentional. But others would admit, yeah, I remember that from school, but thanks for the refresher. It's a little bit easier to understand the way you put it. And then down at the other end, some might still go, yeah, it's still a little bit tough because there's a formula or two in that article and it makes it a bit tough. But that's been my mode of operation, I guess, if you will, over the decades when it comes to writing and speaking.
Yep. No, absolutely. And I really understand what you mean about like the visual and hand. I'm very visual, very hands-on. And sometimes like writing things down has always helped me. I've been fortunate that I've had, in my writing, I've had good mentors, also good editors. You have been a tremendous editor and mentor to me throughout my career, and I am very much appreciative of that, Ron. I'm curious, have you had mentors throughout your career that have helped you grow?
Oh, yes, and the list would be way too big. Certainly, the people that I worked with when I started in cable, those guys were definite mentors. I am fortunate, I think, to have known people like Len Ecker and Ken Simmons. They were some of the early technical pioneers that invented a lot of the technology that we still use today. So I just feel fortunate that I have met those guys, and they're kind of like I'm not worthy to be able to meet people like that. And then over the years, I've been very fortunate to just work with all kinds of people in the companies where I worked, as well as people who worked at other companies or associations that I considered mentors. And even today, I am very fortunate to be able to work in some in volunteer efforts in SCTE and Cable Labs specifications and standards committees and working groups. And I feel fortunate to work with people I consider friends and mentors. But if I started rattling names off here, I'd almost certainly forget somebody, and which would be unintentional. And we could probably spend 30 minutes going through names of people that I've known over the years that I've considered mentors.
How about specific skills and certifications? Are there any ones that you would say, these really helped move my career forward?
Oh gosh, there are several things that could fall under that umbrella of skills and certifications. Generally speaking, I've had an interest in technology for as long as I can remember, going back to grade school and before. That I think inspired me to move into what became a technical career. So there's that piece. I had earned an FCC first class license. Started out with a third class license, then a second class license, and then the first class. Those are the radio telephone licenses. And
it definitely explains why you're so familiar with the FCC rules and regulations.
Well, there's some those old exams were pretty tough, and there's a lot of technology. And I focused primarily on broadcast, but I did a lot of microwave work, and it was a requirement to have an FCC first class license to be able to work on microwave transmitters and other equipment. So I had earned that way back. I also worked on weekends as a disc jockey at a radio station in the 70s. Did that
That's
for
pretty
5 years
cool.
and had to have an FCC license to work at a radio station. And I helped the chief engineer there with studio maintenance and transmitter maintenance and so on. So it was there was some technical stuff involved with that in addition to spinning the wax, as we used to call it, playing actual records. I don't think any radio station does that anymore. So that part was fun. So the FCC license part was a big one, but I embarked down a path that became a good asset to the technology side of cable. And the technology side of cable is a good asset to this hobby. It's called ham radio or amateur radio. I was first licensed in the mid-1970s, and there is so much technology in amateur radio. And yes, there's the regulations and operating procedures and practices, but there's the technology of it. And you can get into that technology as little or as much as you want. And you can dig into transmission line theory and some other things. In fact, as we're doing this, doing this interview, I'm about to embark on the creation of a spreadsheet to calculate quarter wavelength vertical radiator size for vertical quarter wavelength antennas, but taking into account the half wavelength to diameter ratio of the elements and some other things. So I'm going to do a spreadsheet for that. So there's that piece of it, and then in the cable industry, I went through all kinds of vendor training because back in the days, all the major equipment vendors offered technical training seminars. Gerald had them. Pretty much every amplifier manufacturer you can think of had technical training seminars and books and things. And I went to a lot of those and learned from a lot of really, really sharp people. The things like the mathematics of calculating carrier to noise ratio in cable networks, and all kinds of things were covered in there. So I did that, and then the certification piece would, of course, be SCTE. I was the first person in the cable industry certified in the original certification program back in the 80s. It was called the Broadband Broadband Communications, BCT, Broadband Communications Technician and Broadband Communications Engineer Certification Program. So it was called BCTE. Yep. And I was the first person in the industry certified in that program. Started with the technician level exams. There were 7 tests that had to be taken, and as soon as I finished those, then I went on to complete the exams for the engineer level. So I did both, but I was the very, very first person to be certified in that program. And I did some other certifications later on, and I think when SCTE, they gave me, I think they called it emeritus certification. It came out in something like 5 different categories of certification. So I don't have to take the exams anymore, but it's nice to have that certification under the belt, because what it really shows is that the skill sets required to do, say, my job, were reflected in those certifications, and they really showed that, hey, okay, you can take the tests and the nuts and bolts from the book perspective, but I also knew the nuts and bolts from the hands-on perspective because of the work out in the field.
So I'm curious, what was someone pushing you to take these exams, or were you doing that by yourself?
This was all myself, just something I had an interest in doing, and and then that. It was an honor to be the first person certified in that BCTE program. And I really didn't start out doing anything like that, because I looked around at the other people that I knew who were taking the tests, and I considered them a lot smarter than I was. But for me, it was just kind of fun to go through and take the tests when they were released. And I'm trying to remember who it was. It might have been Bill Riker who said that the last exam is being presented. The last test, it was being introduced at, I want to say, I think it was the Eastern Cable Show in Atlanta, and Bill made the comment that I and one other person had completed all the tests, and that was the last one. He said, "Yeah, you were this other person who I never did find out who that was, could be the first person certified." So I thought, oh, that's interesting. So I went and talked to the head of engineering at Jones, and I said, "What do you think? Is this something I should go for?" And he said, "Yeah, get on a plane and get out there and take the test." So I did. And the other guy never showed up for whatever reason. I don't know if it was health or something, but the other person never showed up. So by the luck of the flight to Atlanta, I became the first person certified in that program.
Well, I think it's also your own self motivation to even start having done that in the first place, and I think that's an important theme that you have to be self motivated to get ahead. So, I mean,
You do. And and as we've discussed throughout the length of this interview, I've had a long time interest in learning. I've never stopped learning, even in retirement. Although my wife
I would
would
argue that you're
question.
not that retired, Ron.
Yeah, she says, wait a minute, you used to get paid for those conference calls. And yes, I'm still involved in the cable industry, but I'm still learning.
Yeah, never
This
stop
day,
learning.
I'm an old coot now, but I'm still learning, and to the best that I'm able, I'm still sharing what I've learned.
Yeah. So, moving a little further ahead, how has the cable industry changed since you first started?
Oh gosh, um, it it has changed both in a revolutionary fashion from one perspective and an evolutionary perspective from another. When I started in '72, the cable system where I worked was a 12-channel system. They had 11 active channels. The local channel 3 was not used because of ingress and direct pickup problems, because there was a local channel 3 in the over-the-air environment. So they had 11 channels active in that, but it was the old Vicoa Futura 12 single-ended amplifiers. And I remembered when in the late 50s and early 60s seeing metal boxes on telephone poles. And those, at the time, I had no idea what they were, but I found out later that those metal boxes contain vacuum tube amplifiers for
They served a purpose.
cable system. Yeah, they served a purpose. And, you know, coincidentally, I went to work for that same cable system in '72. So there was that. There was no fiber. I was there when they put a satellite antenna in to receive Showtime. It was just for the one channel. And at the time, the FCC required cable companies to install 10-meter diameter dishes. And in those days, those 10-meter dishes were $100,000 a pop.
Holy cow!
And if you apply inflation and stuff over the years, I think it works out to probably close to the equivalent of $500,000, somewhere around there today. It's just, and there was no technical reason at all for that rule, because this was for receive only. There was no transmitting involved. It was to receive channels from satellite, and the FCC said you got to use 10-meter dishes. Why? Well, we did, and after a couple years, the FCC relaxed the rules and allowed smaller dishes. And Teleprompter, which was the company that I started my career in with, installed the first 5-meter dish in its system in Kalispell, Montana. So that was the very first small dish that was installed. So over time, the technology continued to improve. There was push-pull amplifier technology when I started, but it wasn't real widely used. It was still a lot of single-ended amplifiers. But the introduction of push-pull amplifier technology allowed cable companies to carry more than just 12 channels, because the 12 channels were channels 2 through 6 in the low band and 7 through 13 in the high band. And that channel placement matched the over-the-air, but there was a reason for that, because the distortion products fell below channel 2, above channel 13, and in between channel 6 and 7 in that so-called midband. Yes, you could get cross-modulation distortion if signal levels were out of whack on the active channels in the system, but all those distortions that were problematic fell into those unused parts of the spectrum. And it was the introduction of push-pull amplifiers that allowed cable operators to start using the midband, and then later what was called the superband and the hyperband, so all the stuff above channel 13. So that was more of a gradual evolution. In those days, the '70s, there was AML microwave. It was multi-channel microwave that was used to break up long amplifier cascades. I worked in a system in the late '70s that had a 67 amplifier cascade from the head end to the most distant subscriber. And one of my first big projects there was to put in the Hughes AML microwave to break up those long amplifier cascades. So again, this is evolutionary stuff.
Yeah.
But of course, it's the satellite technology that began with those $100,000 dishes allowed cable companies all over the place to start adding signals to their cable networks that they couldn't otherwise provide to their customers. So we saw the birth of all the superstations and the pay channels like HBO and Showtime. Well, HBO was already there, but because that had been a regional microwave delivered service before it became satellite delivered in the mid 70s. So we saw the birth of all these stations like CNN and MTV and on and on and on and on, and the cable industry really took off. But again, from a growth perspective. But again, this is all evolutionary stuff. So where did some of this revolutionary stuff come into play? Late 80s, the concept of what we now call HFC or hybrid fiber coax was born. ATC under Jim Chittix and Lewis Williamson and some of their colleagues came up with this idea of using analog optical fiber links to transport multiple TV channels. And the thinking was, they'd like to be able to put up to 40 TV channels using amplitude modulation or intensity modulation of the laser light. And the manufacturers of the semiconductor lasers said, this ain't going to work. The second order distortions are going to kill you. And the cable industry was persistent and said, well, we think it will. And sure enough, the industry was right. And in the late 80s, we saw the first systems breaking up their networks using analog fiber optics. So to me, that was one of the revolutionary things that we saw. One might argue that different amplifier technologies could be sort of revolutionary, but maybe it's more of a mix of revolution and evolution, with the heavy emphasis on the evolutionary side as the channel capacity continued to increase. The next big revolutionary thing, I think, that goes beyond being simply evolutionary was the introduction of cable modem technology.
Yeah, DOCSIS.
And even before DOCSIS, we had proprietary technology from the likes of Zenith and
Land City was one.
City and Motorola, but because it was not standardized, it was proprietary. So if you bought, let's say, the Zenith head-end equipment, you had to use the Zenith boxes in the field. Likewise, if you bought the Land City head-end gear, you had to use the Land City modems in the field. And it was the introduction of DOCSIS in the 90s that allowed standardization and interoperability. So you could buy any manufacturer's head-end gear, what we called the cable modem termination system, or CMTS, and any manufacturer's cable modem that complied with the spec. So we saw the introduction of DOCSIS 1.0, then 1.1, 2.0, 3.0, 3.1, and now we're at 4.0. I've heard rumors there could be a 5.0.
DOCSIS 5.
Yeah, we'll see. But that was revolutionary, because think about all the things that the industry's been able to do with cable modem technology. And it's more than just allowing people to access high-speed internet. It's been used for digital voice telephony and services, interactive services, home security, just the list goes on and on and on of the things that we could do. Now, another revolutionary thing, I think, was switching from pure analog NTSC, as some people say, never twice same color, the National Television System Committee, analog format, and it was PAL and CCAM in Europe and elsewhere, but migrating to digitally modulated signals using quadrature amplitude modulation. So what we later, after the introduction of DOCSIS 3.1, we started calling those legacy digital signals, which were really analog signals, at least on the cable network. But we started calling them single carrier QAM signals. And then with DOCSIS 3.1 came the use of OFDM and OFDMA. So that's more, to me, revolutionary rather than just plain old evolutionary. And wow, the things that we've done that you can squeeze into a cable network and the pipeline now. And fiber keeps getting closer to the home, so that's more of an evolution, I think. Fiber to the home is the end goal. Of course, it's always been about 5 years off. I want to say going back to the late 80s, early 90s. Yeah, it's
5 more years, it'll be there. I thought the same thing.
5 more years, another 5 years.
It's always
been 5 years off. And yes, almost every cable operator has some fiber to the home now.
Yes.
But there's a lot of HFC out there, and it's going to be there for a long time.
Yes, 5 more years, we'll have fiber everywhere. So, Ron, if you could give advice to your younger self when you started, what would it be?
Do what you're doing. Keep learning. Never stop asking questions, and share what you know with others.
And I think that's exactly the same advice you'd give to other people, which was going to be my next
question.
Well,
I would. I mean, not only to my early self, but to anybody that's coming into the industry. I think that's really good advice. It's helpful advice. and I think it's a good way to progress one's career. Just never stop learning. That's one of the fun things about this industry we're in. In one of the articles in Broadband Library, I had a reflection on 50 years in the business, and I think it was in that article that I had the statement of that for me, working in the cable industry has been kind of like a hobby with a paycheck.
Yeah,
I'm a geek through and through. I love the technology, and without a doubt, given all the technology that we have in the cable industry, yeah, it's like a hobby being able to work with that technology. And oh wait, there's a paycheck that comes with it. That's pretty cool.
And I think if you can approach it with that mindset, it really changes the way you look at your job. So I think mindset is really, really important.
You got to have fun, and yes, there can be times when it's not fun and when you're pulling your hair out. But as I look back on the last half century plus of being involved in the cable industry, overall, it's been a tremendous amount of fun, and I've met so many wonderful people over the years that have become longtime friends, many of whom have been mentors, and many of those probably don't know that I consider them mentors, but I have certainly looked up to them from many perspectives as mentors and teachers, so that I could continue to learn from their experience. And then I've tried to turn around and follow their example, just like the example set by my colleagues back in the early 70s, that, learn what I can and share it with others.
Well, on the concept of fun, are there any funny stories or memories from your time in the industry that you can share with us?
Oh gosh, there are there are several. That 10-meter dish that I mentioned that the FCC required. This is one of those stories that just makes you cringe rather than so funny. I guess we could look back on it now with a chuckle, but in those days, that 10-meter dish had a limited adjustment range to go across the satellite arc. So the foundation had to be lined up just right, and because there wasn't much adjustment range on the framework underneath this 10-meter dish. And so the cable system hired a local surveyor to survey the ground where the foundation was going. And so it was this huge concrete reinforced foundation was put in for the dish. Come to find out, the surveyor had made a mistake and screwed up the azimuth on this foundation, and the satellite dish couldn't be moved to the satellite carrying showtime.
Small detail.
They had, I think they had to, I don't think they took jackhammered the foundation out. I think they had to get the manufacturer, I believe it was Scientific Atlanta, to come up with custom modification for the framework underneath the dish so it could move over. And I'm not sure who paid for that. I suspect the surveyor did. So that was one of those cringeworthy moments. But one that falls into the category of red-faced embarrassment on my part. I was talking. This was in the 80s sometimes, and I was talking to somebody. I think it was at Gilbert Engineering, and of course Gilbert. Some of the engineers there had come out of General Radio. I mean, these were people that worked in the field of metrology, and somebody, one of them had mentioned, or introduced me to somebody that, hi, this is so-and-so, who is like director of metrology or something. And like a doofus, I said, when did you get interested in weather? And this guy looked at me, and then as soon as I said that, I realized, oh, no, metrology is the study of measurements, and not meteorology is that. And
it's close.
I was redder than this shirt that I'm wearing now. In hindsight, it was a hilarious mistake, but one of those oops.
Oopsie.
That was and there have been other funny things that have happened over the years, some of which may not be suitable for repeating in public, but I think that we all experience at some point or another.
I thought you were going to mention that you put a comma somewhere it didn't belong.
Oh, the William Shatner commas? Yeah, well, I'm a firm believer in the Oxford comma, so I will use commas, but I don't go to and yes, there have been times when I've left them out or should have put them in and didn't. And
And for those who don't know Ron really well, he is a stickler for punctuation and proper grammar, which it's as a writer myself, I've learned a lot from Ron, and Ron's very good at editing.
Yes, and I continue to give him a bad time about his articles when I do edit them.
Yes.
And I think he intentionally does stuff like leave a comment.
No, it's the best I can do, Ron.
Let's see if Ron catches this.
It's the best I can do.
I was on the serious side of that. I enjoy editing, and which is funny because in school I hated writing. I didn't like it, and it was later on and when I realized that, wait a minute, I can write about something I actually enjoy, writing about technology. And I was once again very fortunate to have worked with some wonderful editors at Communications Technology Magazine who were great teachers. They taught me a lot about writing, and they taught me a lot about editing, and so that's worked well. And it's just kind of all come together in this love of technical writing, and that's never gone away. Even now in retirement, in my involvement in some of the SCTE working groups, I'm still doing a lot of writing of specs and standards and other things. So I still find that to be a lot of fun.
It's funny how life is like that. Something you hate when you're younger, you love when you get older.
Yes.
Ron, any final words of wisdom for those who are watching?
Well, I feel somewhat envious of the people who are just joining the industry today. Those of you who are new to cable, or if you're working in the outside plant, that's great. You're getting your hands on the physical networks out there, but you're in an industry that is showing no signs of stopping its adoption of just all kinds of amazing technologies. And long after I'm gone, those technologies are going to continue to grow and change, and there'll be new technologies that people had no idea were coming. So I'm envious from that perspective that those people who are starting in the industry today or who've been in it just for a few years are going to get to play with that technology. And I still love playing with technology, but I can't get my hands on it as much as I used to because I'm not working for anybody where I have that opportunity. But the involvement through SCTE and stuff does allow me to at least be familiar with it. But just take advantage of all that technology, learn as much about it as you can, and have fun with it.
Enjoy it. Thank you, Ron. So that wraps it up, folks, for this episode of The Cable Climb. A big thank you to Ron Hranac for sharing his journey and offering practical advice to help technicians move forward in their own careers. We hope today's conversation gave you new insights and ideas to explore and inspiration for your professional growth in the cable industry. If you found this episode valuable, be sure to hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss the next conversation with another industry pro. And if you have any questions or topics you'd like us to cover, drop them in a comment box below. We're here to help you keep climbing one step at a time. Thanks for joining me and Ron, and I'll see you in the next time on The Cable Climb. Take care.